The letter arrived on a Tuesday, yellowed and smelling faintly of lavender. My great aunt Millicent, whom I'd met exactly twice in my 28 years, had left me her estate in the countryside. I nearly threw it away, thinking it was some cruel joke. But the lawyer's letterhead looked legitimate, and frankly, my studio apartment was suffocating me. I remember staring at that letter for hours, reading it over and over again. Miss Sarah Chu, it began, "We regret to inform you of the passing of your great aunt, Millicent Rosewood. As per her last will and testament, you are the sole beneficiary of her estate, including the manor house and all its contents." The words felt surreal. Aunt Millicent had been this mysterious figure in our family, the eccentric relative who lived alone in some grand house that no one ever talked about. My mother had mentioned her maybe 3 times in my entire life, and always with this strange look in her eyes, like she was remembering something she'd rather forget. But here I was, suddenly the owner of a Victorian mansion I'd never seen, in a town I'd never heard of. The lawyer, Mr. Hartwell, had included detailed instructions about the keys, the property taxes, and something called special arrangements that I didn't understand. There was also a handwritten note from Aunt Millicent herself. "Sarah, the house has been waiting for you. Take care of it, and it would take care of you. Some things are meant to be inherited by those who can appreciate them. You'll understand soon enough. Love, Aunt Millie." 3 weeks later, I stood before Rosewood Manor, a Victorian beast that loomed against the grey October sky like something from a Gothic novel. The drive had taken me through winding, country roads lined with autumn maples, their leaves creating a tunnel of gold and crimson above my car. But nothing had prepared me for this. The wrought iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, and I swear I heard a sigh carried on the wind. The house itself was magnificent in its decay. 3 stories of weathered brick, towering chimneys and windows that seemed to watch my every move. Ivy crawled up the walls, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly under the weight of decades. As I walked up the stone pathway, I noticed the gardens. They were overgrown, but not wild, as if someone had been tending them recently, but with a light touch. Rose bushes lined the walkway, their blooms somehow still vibrant despite the late season. The fountain in the center of the circular drive was dry, but I could imagine how beautiful it must have been in its prime. The key turned to Sally in the heavy oak door, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through stained glass windows. The furniture was covered in white sheets, creating ghostly silhouettes throughout the grand foyer. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals catching the light and casting rainbow patterns on the walls. Everything smelled of old wood, roses, and something else I couldn't quite place, something sweet and cloying. The entrance hall was breathtaking. A grand staircase curved upward, its mahogany banister polished to a warm glow. Oil paintings in ornate frames lined the walls. Portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women from bygone era. I wondered if any of them were relatives I'd never known about. I spent the first few hours exploring, marveling at the ornate details. Each room told a story. The parlor had a piano that looked like it hadn't been played in decades, sheet music still sitting on the bench. The dining room featured a table that could seat 12, with china cabinets filled with delicate porcelain. But it was the library that took my breath away. The library was my favorite room immediately. Floor to ceiling, bookshelves stretched up to a coffered ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd been collected over generations. It's a fireplace, large enough to stand, dominated one wall, with comfortable reading chairs arranged nearby. The smell of old paper and leather was intoxicating. I pulled a few books from the shelves. First editions of Dickens, Shakespeare, and poets I'd only read about in college. Someone had loved these books, had cared for them. I found handwritten notes in the margins, pressed flowers between pages, and bookmarks made from ribbon and lace. The kitchen was ancient but functional, with a massive wood-burning stove and a pantry stocked with canned goods that looked surprisingly fresh. Someone had been maintaining this place, but who? Mr. Hartwell had mentioned a caretaker, but I hadn't seen anyone. When I explored the bedrooms, I chose the smallest one on the second floor. It was cozy, with a 4-poster bed and a window that overlooked the gardens. The master bedroom felt too... occupied. I couldn't explain it, but standing in that doorway, I felt like I was intruding on someone's private space. That night, I made a simple dinner in the ancient kitchen and tried to ignore the way the house seemed to breathe around me. Old houses settle, I told myself. The creaking and groaning were perfectly normal. As I sat in the library with a cup of tea, reading one of the books I'd found, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway above. I went to bed early, exhausted from the day's emotions and the long drive. But sleep didn't come easily. The house was too quiet, yet somehow too loud. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind through the settling of old wood, the soft whisper of fabric against fabric. Then I heard a woman's voice, humming a melody I didn't recognize. It was coming from somewhere in the house, distant but clear. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, something that sounded like it came from another era. I lay frozen, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The humming continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it was almost deafening. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, I found nothing but empty hallways and closed doors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Stress, new environment, overactive imagination, all perfectly reasonable explanations for what I'd experienced. The bright October sunlight streaming through the windows made the previous night's fears seem silly. I decided to focus on practical matters, going through Aunt Millicent's belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to sell. I started with the master bedroom, the one I'd avoided the night before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. It was a stunning room with a four-poster bed draped in burgundy velvet, an antique vanity with a three-way mirror, and a sitting area by the window overlooking the garden. Everything was perfectly preserved, as if Aunt Millicent had just stepped out for a moment. Her clothes still hung in the massive wardrobe, elegant dresses from decades past, fur stoles, and jewelry boxes filled with pearls and vintage brooches. But it was more than that. The room felt lived in warmth, despite no one having occupied it for months. On the vanity, I found a collection of perfume bottles, their contents long evaporated, but still faintly fragrant. Behind them was a silver-framed photograph that stopped me cold. It wasn't Aunt Millicent, but someone younger, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was wearing a 1940s style dress. Her hair styled in victory rolls, and something about her seemed familiar, though I was certain I'd never seen her before. I picked up the photograph, studying her face. She looked like she was about my age, maybe a little younger, with an expression of quiet contentment. There was something in her eyes, though a sadness that seemed to run deeper than the photograph could contain. She was beautiful, wasn't she? I spun around so fast, I nearly dropped the photograph, my heart hammering against my ribs. A woman stood in the doorway, the same woman from the photograph. She wore the same dress, her hair styled in the same vintage way, but she was translucent, like morning mist given shape, and I could see the hallway behind her through her form. My mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. This was some kind of hallucination, a side effect of stress and too little sleep. But here she was, moving with perfect grace, her form flickering slightly in the morning light. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping into the room with an apologetic smile. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Margaret. I lived here once. Her voice was soft, cultured, with the kind of accent you heard in old movies. She moved closer, and I noticed that while she casts no shadow, her presence seemed to warm the room. You're dead," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. She smiled sadly, an expression that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Yes, dead. I died in 1943, but I never left this house. It holds onto things, especially things that loved it." I sank onto the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Margaret moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens with obvious affection. "I understand your shock. Your great-aunt reacted much the same way when she first saw me. That was... Oh, it must have been 30 years ago now. Aunt Millicent could see you. Oh, yes. She was quite gifted in that way. We became dear friends, actually. She was the first person in decades who didn't run away screaming." Margaret turned back to me, her expression hopeful. "I do hope you won't run away screaming." I stared at her, trying to process what I was seeing. She looked so real, so solid that if not for her translucent quality, I would have thought she was just an ordinary woman in vintage clothing. How is this possible? I'm not entirely sure, Margaret admitted, settling gracefully into the chair by the window. I died of influenza during the war. One day I was burning with fever, and the next, well, I wasn't. I was still here, still aware, still in love with this house and unable to leave it. Over the next hour, Margaret told me her story. She'd come to Rosewood Manor in 1941 as a companion to the elderly woman who owned it then. She'd been engaged to a soldier named Thomas, who was supposed to return from the war so they could be married and live in the house together. He never came back, she said simply. I received word that he'd been killed in action just 3 months before I died. I kept waiting for him, hoping that maybe the news was wrong. That he'd walk through that front door and we'd have our life together. She explained how she'd watched the house change hands over the decades, how she'd tried to communicate with various owners with mixed results. Some had sensed her presence and fled. Others had ignored the signs entirely. A few, like Aunt Millicent, had embraced her existence. Your aunt was lonely, Margaret said. She'd never married, never had children. She said I was the daughter she'd never had, and I'd never had a mother who understood me. We kept each other company. I found myself relaxing as she spoke. Despite the impossibility of the situation, Margaret's presence was oddly comforting. She had a gentle way about her, a kindness that transcended her supernatural state. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Margaret's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. Because you're different. You belong here. I can feel it. But I also feel that you might be able to help me. Help you how? She stood and began to pace, her form flickering slightly as she moved. I've been searching for something for 80 years. A letter that Thomas wrote to me before he died. A letter that was never delivered. I believe it's somewhere in this house. And I think finding it might give me the closure I need. Closure to do what? Margaret stopped pacing and looked directly to finally leave. To find peace. To move on to wherever it is I'm supposed to go. The weight of her words settled over me like a blanket. She'd been trapped here for 8 decades, waiting for something she'd never received, clinging to a love that had ended before it could truly begin. Over the following days, Margaret and I developed what I can only describe as the most unusual friendship of my life. She would appear in different rooms throughout the house, sometimes solid enough to cast shadows, other times barely visible, like a reflection in water. Her presence became as natural to me as the morning coffee I made in the ancient kitchen. She told me about her life before death, how she'd grown up in the city but always dreamed of living in the countryside. How she'd met Thomas at a USO dance, how they planned to turn one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery for the children they'd hoped to have be. Her stories painted a picture of a life full of hope that had been cut tragically short. I was 24 when I died, she said one afternoon as we sat in the library. the same age Thomas was when he was killed. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I stayed. We were both frozen in time, waiting for a future that would never come. I found myself looking forward to her appearances. She had opinions about everything. The books I read, the way I arranged the furniture, even my choice of tea. She was particularly passionate about the garden's tree, which she'd maintained during her living years and somehow continued to influence even as a spirit. The roses were my specialty, she explained, as we stood by the library window looking out at the overgrown beds. I've been trying to keep them alive all these years. It's difficult. It takes so much energy to affect the physical world. That's when I learned that Margaret wasn't just a passive observer. She could touch things, though it required considerable effort and left her drained. She showed me by picking up a book from the library table, her form flickering like a candle flame as she concentrated. Your aunt and I worked together, she said, setting the book down carefully. She would do the physical work, and I would guide her. The house has been maintained by our partnership for 3 decades. This revelation changed everything. The fresh groceries in the pantry, the well-tended roses, the preserved condition of the furniture. It all made sense now. Aunt Millicent and Margaret had been a team, and now Margaret was hoping I would fill that role. I can show you the house's secrets, Margaret offered. There are hidden passages, secret compartments, things that have been forgotten for generations. Your aunt loved discovering them. She led me through the house like a tour guide, pointing out details I'd missed. Behind a bookshelf in the library was a hidden door that led to a small study. Under the main staircase was a storage room filled with trunks of old clothes and documents. In the master bedroom, a section of the wall panel opened to reveal a safe. Every old house has its mysteries, Margaret explained. This one more than most. It was built by a man who loved secrets, and every owner since has added their own. Oh, it was during one of these explorations that Margaret revealed the true reason for her openness with me. I've been searching for Tomas's letter for 80 years, she said as we examined a hidden compartment in the dining room. I've looked everywhere I can think of, but the house is vast, and there are places I can't access alone. I need someone who can physically search, someone who cares enough to help me. The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking. I couldn't imagine being trapped for so long, holding on to hope for something that might not even exist. What makes you think the letter is here? I asked. Margaret's form solidified slightly, as if the memory gave her strength. Thomas wrote to me regularly during the war. His letters always arrived through the same postal route, delivered by the same mail. But after he died, there were reports of mail trucks being delayed, letters being lost. I received word of his death, but never his final letter. She explained that the postmaster in town had been a friend of the family, and it was possible that the letter had been held at the post office or even brought to the house personally. During the chaos of her illness and death, it could have been misplaced, stored away, forgotten. Your aunt believed me, Margaret said. She helped me search, but we never found it. She said that maybe it was meant for you to find when you came. She knew I would come. Margaret smiled. the expression lighting up her ethereal features. She always said the house would choose its next guardian. She believed it chose you. That evening, we began our search in earnest. Margaret showed me how to detect the subtle signs of hidden compartments, the slight variations in wood grain, the nearly invisible seams in the wallpaper, the panels that sounded hollow when tapped. She had decades of experience with the house's secrets, and she guided me with the patience of someone who had literally all the time in the world. Play. We started with the obvious places: the master bedroom, the library, the study. We looked through desk drawers, behind picture frames, inside old books. Margaret could sense things I couldn't, directing me to areas that felt significant to her. There, she would say, pointing to a section of wall. Something about that corner feels different. But night after night, we found nothing. Old photographs, forgotten jewelry, business documents from previous owners, but no letter from Tommy. I began to wonder if it existed at all, or if Margaret was clinging to a hope that had no basis in reality. It was during our 5th night of searching that Margaret told me something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. "I've been selfish," she said suddenly, her voice barely whispered. "I've stayed here all these years, not just because of Thomas, but because I was afraid. Afraid of what comes next. Afraid of leaving the only home I've ever truly loved." She looked around the library, her eyes taking in every detail, as if memorizing it. "By watching you settle in, seeing how you care for the house, how you've made it come alive again. Wow. I think I'm finally ready to let go. I just need to know." That his final words to me weren't lost forever. In that moment, I understood that finding the letter wasn't just about closure for Margaret. It was about her final act of love, both for Thomas and for the house that had sheltered her spirit for so long. Our search intensified as the days grew shorter, and November arrived with its crisp winds and bare branches. Margaret seemed to grow more determined, more focused, as if she sensed that time was running out in some way I couldn't understand. She led me to increasingly obscure hiding places, inside the mechanisms of grandfather clocks, behind loose stones, in the cellar walls, even in the space between the roof and the ceiling of the 3rd floor. The How remembers everything, Margaret told me one evening as we explored the attic. Every joy, every sorrow, every secret. That's why I can't leave. I'm part of its memory now. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten history. We found boxes of photographs dating back to the house's construction, documents detailing its various owners, and personal belongings from generations of residents. Margaret could identify people in the photographs, tell me their stories, explain their connection to the house. "This was Mrs. Hartwell," she said, pointing to a stern-looking woman in a Victorian dress. "She owned the house when it was new. She used to host elaborate parties, and people would come from the city just to see her ballroom." "There's a ballroom?" I asked, amazed. Margaret's eyes lit up. "Oh, yes. On the 3rd floor. It's been closed off for decades, but it's still there. Perhaps we should look there next. The ballroom was accessed through a door I'd assumed was a closet. When Margaret guided me to open it, I found a narrow staircase leading up to what had once been a magnificent space. The room was enormous, with polished wooden floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that would have flooded the space with light during the day. A massive chandelier hung from the center of the ceiling, and I could imagine couples dancing beneath it in the house's heyday. "I used to come here to think," Margaret said, her form becoming more solid as she moved across the dance floor. "After Thomas left for the war, I would put on the gramophone and dance alone, pretending he was here with me. But even in this romantic setting, we found no trace of Thomas's letter. We searched behind the wainscoting, inside the piano bench, even in the space behind the mirrors that lined one wall, nothing. It was Margaret who suggested we return to the library. Books were special to Thomas, she said. He was studying literature before the war. If there's anywhere his letter might be hidden, it would be there. We'd searched the library before. But this time, Margaret approached it differently. Instead of looking for hidden compartments, she began examining the books themselves. Thomas loved poetry, she said, running her translucent fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes. He used to quote Keats and Shelley in his letters, he said. That when he came back, we'd read together by the fireplace. That's when I had an idea. If Thomas's letter had been delivered to the house, and if someone had wanted to preserve it safely, where better to hide it than inside a book? It was a romantic notion, the kind of thing that would appeal to someone who loved literature. We began systematically examining every book in the library. Margaret would identify volumes that seemed significant. Books about love, poetry, collections, novels about war and separation. I would carefully flip through the pages, looking for anything that didn't belong. Hours passed. My eyes grew tired from examining page after page, but Margaret's enthusiasm kept me going. She grew more animated as we worked, more solid, as if the very act of searching energized her. "Try that one," she said, pointing to a slim volume of poetry high on a shelf. "In Keats." Thomas quoted from it in his letters. I pulled the book down and immediately noticed something unusual. The binding was slightly different from the others, as if it had been rebound at some point. The spine was tighter, the leather slightly newer. "This book has been repaired," I said, showing it to Margaret. Her eyes widened, opened it carefully. "By did." And as I flipped through the pages, I noticed that the binding was unusually thick. There was something inside it, something that didn't belong. Using a letter opener from the desk, I carefully began to separate the binding from the spine. And there it was. The letter was folded into a small square, sewn into the binding of the book with careful stitches. It was sealed with age. The ink faded, but still legible. On the outside, in a masculine hand, was written, "For my dearest Margaret, my eternal love." Margaret's form began to shimmer more brightly as I held the letter. Tears, actual tears that sparkled like drops of moonlight, ran down her cheeks. Pure, You found it, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. You actually found it. My hands shook as I carefully unfolded the letter. It was written on military stationery, dated just days before Thomas's death. The handwriting was hurried but heartfelt, and I could feel the love and desperation in every word. Would you read it to me? Margaret asked. I haven't heard his voice in so long. I cleared my throat and began to read. My dearest Margaret, my beloved, my heart. If you are reading this, then my premonition was correct, and I will not be coming home to you. I am writing this on what I believe will be my final night, and my thoughts are only of you and the life we planned together. I want you to know that every moment we shared was a gift. Every letter from you was a light in the darkness of this war. The thought of you waiting for me in our beautiful house gave me strength when I had none left. I know you will grieve for me, my darling, but I beg you not to let grief consume the vibrant, beautiful woman I fell in love with. Live, Margaret, live the life we dreamed of, even if I cannot share it with you. Find love again. Have the children we talked about. Fill that house with laughter and joy. The house will keep you safe, but don't let it keep you prisoner. You were meant for so much more than waiting for a ghost. Promise me you'll live, my love. Promise me you'll be happy. I will love you always in this life, and whatever comes after. But my greatest wish is that you will love again, that you will find peace and joy and all the beautiful things you deserve. Until we meet again, my eternal love, Thomas. As I finished reading, Margaret's form began to shimmer more brightly. She was smiling through her tears, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked truly at peace. The letter had an immediate and profound effect on Margaret. As I finished reading Thomas's final words, her form began to change. She became more luminous, more solid, as if the letter had given her a kind of strength she hadn't possessed in decades. He knew, she said, her voice filled with wonder. He knew I would stay. He knew I would wait. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold all the starlight in the world. But he also knew what I needed to hear, to finally let go. Margaret didn't disappear immediately. She stayed for several more days, and during that time, she seemed different, lighter, more at peace. She showed me things about the house she'd never shared before, as if she were preparing me to be its sole guardian. The roses in the garden need to be pruned in early spring, she explained as we walked through the grounds. Bye, not too early. Wait until the last frost has passed, and the fountain can be repaired. The mechanism is still intact, just needs cleaning. She showed me the hidden garden where she'd spent so many hours during her living years. A small enclosed space behind the kitchen where herbs still grew wild. I planted these myself, she said, touching the ghostly remains of lavender and rosemary. Your aunt helped me maintain them. They're yours now, in the music room. She sat at the piano pro. The keys moved under her translucent fingers, and the sound filled the house with music it hadn't heard in years. This was our song, she said, her voice soft with memory. Thomas hummed it to me the night before he left for the war. I've been playing it for him ever since, hoping he could hear it somehow. But it was in the library that we spent our final evening together. Margaret helped me understand the house's history, pointing out which books were first editions, which had been gifts, which contained pressed flowers or handwritten notes from previous owners. "You'll take care of the house, won't you?" she asked as we sat by the fireplace. "You'll love it the way it deserves to be loved." "I will," I promised. "I'll love it the way you did, Bo." She smiled, and for a moment she looked completely solid and real and alive. It shows. "Well," she said, "you were always meant to be here. I can feel it in the way the house responds to you, the way it seems to sigh with contentment when you're near. But that night, I felt the house shift around me, as if it were exhaling a breath it had held for 80 years. The creaking and settling sounds that had initially unsettled me now seemed like a lullaby, the house's way of singing me to sleep. When I woke the next morning, Margaret was gone, but she hadn't left quietly. On my bedside table was a single white rose, impossibly fresh and fragrant. Beside it was a note written in her elegant handwriting. "Thank you for setting me free. The house is yours now, but you'll never be alone in it. Love, Margaret." I surged to the house, calling her name, but I knew she was truly gone. The feeling of her presence, which had become so familiar, was absent, but the house itself felt different. Not empty, but somehow complete, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for this resolution, for 80 years. The changes were subtle at first. The roses in the garden seemed to bloom more vibrantly. The fountain, which had been dry for years, suddenly began to flow with clear, cool water. The piano in the music room stayed perfectly tuned, even though I never touched it. It was as if Margaret's love for the house had been transformed into something more permanent, more peaceful. I've been living in Rosewood Manor for 8 months now. I work as a freelance graphic designer, and the house provides endless inspiration. The library has become my office, and I often find myself working late into the night, surrounded by the books Margaret loved, warmed by the fireplace she used to sit beside. I've restored the garden, following Margaret's guidance from our conversations. I've repaired the fountain, which now serves as a focal point for the front courtyard. I've opened the ballroom and hosted small gatherings, something I never would have imagined doing before, which feels right in this house that was meant for celebration. Sometimes, late at night, I hear echoes of the past. Not Margaret, but the house itself, remembering the laughter of children who once played in the halls, the music from longer parties, the whispered conversations of lovers who walked these corridors. But these sounds don't frighten me anymore. They're part of the house's story, part of its soul. I'm not alone here. Not really. How is full of memories and stories. And I'm just the latest chapter in its long history. But I'm also its guardian now, its keeper of secrets and story. I've learned to listen to what it needs, to respond to its rhythms, to be worthy of the trust Margaret placed in me. Sometimes, when the light is just right, I swear, I can see her in the garden, tending her roses and smiling. She's at peace now, but she's also part of the house's memory, part of its story, as am I, too. The inheritance wasn't just a house. It was a responsibility, a trust, a connection to something larger than myself. I inherited a mansion, yes, but I also inherited its ghosts, its history, its soul. And in helping Margaret find her peace, I found my own place in the world. Some say that houses choose their owners, not the other way around. As I write this in the library where Margaret and I spent so many evenings, I know that's true. Rosewood Manor chose me, just as it chose her, just as it chose all the others who loved it before us. The previous owner never left. She simply became part of the house's story. And someday, perhaps, so will I. But for now, I'm content to be its guardian, its chronicler, its friend. The house has given me a home, a purpose, and a story I never could have imagined, and in the end, that's the greatest inheritance of all.